Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Andrea, for putting together such a powerful film. And I know I'm a little bit choked up. Maybe sometimes art is, is the only thing that can capture a truly, I'd say, chaotic moment, as we're in at the moment, and one in which, lots of things concerning Syria are turned upside down. The other issue, of course, is I know a lot of people that were in the film. Razan was extremely, both Mouaz on this end and also Razan out in the field. She really just was such a workhorse in connecting us with people who were inside. I know a lot of people have criticized the administration, and particularly its decision over not to enforce the red line, as affecting American credibility in the region. And I tend to agree with that from a decision-making point of view. But I think what's brought to light by this film is that it actually goes quite a bit deeper than that. And those of us that covered this up close and personal, and many of us from the Institute, myself, Jeff White, and others, went to Syrian border regions a number of times. The fact is that I think it's quite clear from this film that there were many of those in the Syrian opposition that we knew. There were many moderates that openly reached out to the United States. We interviewed them. They reached out through Razan. Our intelligence services met with them. They were very active on social media. And in spite of that, they were held at arm's length. Not so much in terms of the humanitarian assistance, which I don't want to poo-poo that. The United States has provided a tremendous amount of humanitarian assistance, but to support those who were trying to achieve what actually was a policy goal of the United States, and that was to get President Assad to step aside and to bring about a democratic and prosperous, post-Assad Syria. And in not supporting them, I think it calls into question this nation's integrity, and I think that's a much deeper matter. Not because any out of a moralistic judgment, but simply presented with the facts. I think a large part of integrity is, what is your response when you are confronted with these facts? This is probably one of the hardest things, and I think this is something that the film captures. One of the hardest, one reason why I think this was extremely hard for an administration and a White House that did not want to get further involved, was constantly being confronted with these films, these YouTube clips. And this is what made what's happened over the last few years undeniable, and very different than the situation in 1982, the last time the United States and the West in particular turned a blind eye to Syria's first massacre. And anyways, I think it was extremely powerful, and I think it captures where we are now. And so with those very brief comments, perhaps I'd just like to have Mouaz and Andrea just say a few words, and then we'll just go into the question and answer period. I would suspect, I saw some tears being wiped away from various eyes here in the audience. I suspect you have some questions or perhaps statements. So Mouaz first, and then let Andrea sew it all up.
Sure. Thank you for having us here, Andrew, and the Washington Institute, for giving us a chance to screen the movie here. And I want to thank Andrea because she was very, very brave. I mean, you don't see the people behind the camera, but she was in all kinds of situations, and some of them were quite dangerous. The part with the hospital, we were only 3 kilometers from the front lines of the regime, and when it came to also like other places where we had brush-ins with extreme groups. So it's really great to have, in a place where it's very not safe for journalists or Westerners and so on, for Andrea and Oliver to have the bravery to do this and to be able to cover, what was going on. I really am more interested in listening to what questions you guys may have and everything, but I just want to, what we've seen in terms of the chemical weapons attacks, what we hear about all the time in terms of the shelling and the barrel bombs and the Scud missiles used against civilian targets. These are all horrendous atrocities, but it's way, way worse than even how horrible this film may have looked, or other places where we see on TV. To give you one example is for example, we've been working on trying to get, there's a bunch of, there was a photographer in a report that came out a while ago, Carter Rock report, that came out about a guy whose pseudonym is Caesar, who was hired by the regime to document the regime's atrocities in terms of torture in state security prisons. And that amounted to 55,000 photos of more than 20,000 people that have been tortured to death. And to be honest, I've seen some of these photos. It's reminiscent of all the most horrendous things that you could ever think of that have happened, during in modern history, and it's sort of a never again moment that is ongoing, and it goes on every single day. So, as the situation changes, as new threats and the dynamics on the ground change, the fact remains that civilians are being killed all the time in the most horrendous ways, and it continues as we sit here today. So I'll just end there, but thank you all for coming and for your time.
Andrea?
I also wanted to join Mouaz in thanking the Washington Institute. When we first started the piece, we didn't seek to do a story about Syria. Actually, a producer who's here from Al Jazeera introduced me to Mouaz. And Mouaz, when I met him, was talking about a narrative that we weren't receiving here. There was a huge gap of what was going on the ground and then the information that was coming back. And so I felt that this was a story that we really needed the world to hear. And, it was 2.5 years of filming. I may be up here by myself, but I have a really wonderful team that was alongside me, behind me, very long days, long nights. Recently, I kind of felt like one of those bugs that comes up from the ground and is blinded by the light, because we've been so buried deep in telling the story. But, we had over 350 hours of footage. And I think what's also important to point out is sometimes what happens off screen, behind the scenes, that's just as important as what you see on the screen. I think the scene with the women that were learning the electoral process and in governance, that was, for me, such a transformative moment. I was always the one that was, complaining and frustrated if I had to go out and vote. But I can tell you, after watching these women, and in not such a fantastic environment, you're looking at a hotel with Disney characters on the wall, and it's a little crate, a box that carried wine glasses that they're using as their ballot box. But you could feel their infectious enthusiasm. You could feel how important it was for them to have this chance. And when Nagam said, "We're dying to vote," she wasn't saying that just figuratively. It was literally. And in that moment, for me, I felt like I was learning more about what a democratic process is, knowing what these women sacrificed to be there and knowing the value that they placed in going through the exercise that they did. And so, my feeling is that I learned about democracy from Syrian women. That's who introduced really what the power of democracy can be. And then there were these other moments. One was when we were in Toronto recently and screened the film at Hot Docs. And we were giving Razan kind of an overview, a historical overview, and she had never known or been exposed to or had heard of the Holocaust. It was something that completely came to her as a shock. And we had equal gaps in what we were learning about her history. So there were these things, and sometimes they were even funny. I mean, recently we went through some footage where Mouaz is schooling Razan about the 3 branches of the U.S. government and teaching her about the Constitution. And she turned to him and said, "You mean constipation?" And he said, "No, the Constitution, it's a little different." And then she said, like this, like, "I don't understand, what do you mean?" And at that moment, Mouaz is like looking and trying to figure out, goes, "Just forget about it. Take it from me. It's Constitution." But anyway, I think the other just point that I would want to make is that I'm not a Syrian expert. I wouldn't even stretch myself to say I'm an expert in the Middle East. I'm a storyteller. And to me, the stories that I came across were either of this kind of operatic beauty or monstrous terror. And I had promised myself when I was with Mouaz, specifically it was at Haji Paja when we had arrived and just seen how desperate these people were, how vulnerable they were, that we wouldn't forget them and that their story would be told. So thank you for listening and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Mouaz. I'll start with questions. Sir?
My question, thank you for the wonderful, powerful film that I think should be mandatory viewing for anyone who's interested in Syria policy. My question is for Mouaz, and there are two parts, but very quick. ISIS, talk about it. Where does it fit into the current picture now? Secondly, many of us who are following this very closely certainly felt, like Senator McCain 2-3 years ago, that the moderate opposition should have been supported. But right now, is that train out of the station? How is it really? Is the moderate opposition basically lost in the current conflict that's happening in Syria?
Yeah, so as far as ISIS, and then I think, these two questions are very much connected. ISIS is something that was, before is the Islamic State of Iraq, before Syria had happened, during the awakening that happened, and there was the surge as well, but I think the awakening had a really important role in disseminating al-Qaeda in Iraq at that time, because we supported tribal leaders and local people, Sunnis themselves that were, completely against that brand of extremism, or extremism in general. ISIS, obviously, if you compare it to everything else, it's the most extreme. Al-Qaeda has even sort of said that it's too extreme for it, so that can sort of show you the extent of how crazy they are. But to tell you the truth, the fact is that the key to defeating ISIS, even in Iraq, really lies in Syria. I don't want to go too much into Iraq, but in Iraq you have a very sectarian government that is very obviously loyal to Iran, something that we did not envision. We wanted Maliki to be someone much more different, an inclusive democracy. But unfortunately, he sort of pointed his guns not against terrorists, but against his political opponents. And that resulted in sort of disillusioning everybody there, which allowed ISIS to roll through, because no one really, from the awakening and from the Sunni indigenous populations themselves, didn't stop them because of how angry they were at Maliki. And I think that's a big problem. But in Syria, it is clear by all factions of the Free Syria Army, even some Islamist battalions, most Islamist battalions, if not all of them, everybody's against ISIS there. And no, the train has not passed in terms of supporting moderate oppositions. Through these sort of 3 years, we've seen factions that have weathered the regime and extremists over time. We saw by Syrian revolutionaries some of the biggest counter-terrorism operations that have happened in recent history without a single bullet or any support from the United States government, all while also fighting against the regime as well. And to give you just examples, in the suburbs of Damascus, you have 12,000 or more in battalions that are popular on the ground that are against ISIS, which is trying to infiltrate eastern Ghouta, the Damascus suburbs that are under siege, and Homs, where Razan has very close connections, and we have good friends. You also have 2,000 strong that have, are ready to fight both extremism and the regime. Harakat Hazm, for example, in the north, in Idlib, and others there are also available. So we do have people that we need to support, but what we have to remember is that as the time goes on, it becomes later and later and later. I don't think that we should say, well, we should have acted a long time ago and now it's too late and we can't. I think that, no, there's still a chance. We must still support. There are many that want to fight the regime and want to get rid of extremists. And the only thing that can defeat extremism, Sunni extremism in this case, is Sunni moderates. If you theoretically were to arm Iran, Maliki, and Assad to fight extremism, all that would do is entrench Iranian hegemony in the region and make sure that Sunni extremists have the greatest recruitment mechanism ever. I think that we need to follow a strategy of both fighting against the regime, which is the biggest magnet for extremists, specifically ISIS, but others as well. And we need to support moderate factions to fight both the regime and extremists. And that is really the only antidote for them. I don't see any other way out of it.
And just to put a sort of cap on that, I think that's the reason, the very good logic that Mouaz has outlined is the reason why you've seen successive officials leaving the administration who advocated arming moderates for various reasons. And we would begin with Ambassador Hoff, Ambassador Ford, but also point to more subtleties. Jonathan Stevenson, who left the NSC, who also recently, the New York Times advocated for that. I don't think in this case some have advocated just switching back to using to the states, essentially, a narrow government in Baghdad, Shia government in Baghdad, and a narrow Shia-based government in Damascus, and using those state assets to blast their Sunni populations into submission. I don't know when that's ever worked, and I don't think it's going to work this time either, especially in the face of such bloodletting. I think that's one reason for the tension that you found. Many have said, well, how can we be announcing this $500 million package at the same time when it seems like moderates are down and out in the Syrian revolution? And I think it's because strategically they know what they need to do, but the persistent theme has been too little and too late, too slow. And until we catch up, I'm afraid, things in Syria and Iraq and the region are not going to be going our way. Did you have a question?
Where are you showing this film? Because it needs to be widely distributed. And do you have distribution?
We premiered the film at the Hot Docs Film Festival in Toronto. We did pick up a distributor, Film Buff, there. It's going out on VOD July 29th, which would mean iTunes, Amazon. But we are finding obstacles. There is a political overlay, and it's not necessarily a popular one with the film. So at this point, there have been a few networks that have turned us down, but we're still looking for a broadcaster and a home beyond the VOD. In the fall, we'll have our U.S. festival premiere at the Woodstock Film Festival, in which one of the musicians who's based in Manhattan, who's Syrian exile, Kenan Azmeh, hopefully will be able to also play live and appear there.
Robert Friedman, Johns Hopkins University. Wonderful film, thank you. Mouaz, appreciate your courage as well. I have a very difficult question. When you have a president of the United States whose mantra appears to be, I got us out of Iraq, I'm getting us out of Afghanistan, I'm not getting us into Syria, how much support do you really think this administration is going to give to the opposition? Or, on a more optimistic note, is what's happened in Iraq perhaps going to shift the balance a little bit, do you think, in the president's thinking?
No, that's a great question, and unfortunately, it's been like slamming our head against just a wall for the past 3 years. I mean, we have met often with the National Security Council. We've done all kinds of ideas that we could think of to try to pressure this administration to take a bigger leadership role in Syria. I think that as we see what's unfolding in the Middle East now, this is all resulting from our inaction in Syria, especially in Iraq, a place where we've invested so much blood and time and so on, and we're seeing it fall apart now. I think that hopefully can help at least start just thinking again about maybe doing something more. But unfortunately, I think the administration has got its mind set, and like you said, he was elected to get us out of the Middle East at all costs, regardless of whether we agree with for Iraq or other things. I mean, in Syria, regardless of its specific and unique situation, he's just not interested in action there. But I do believe in the American people, as idealistic as that may sound, and I do believe in working with the different branches of government and everybody here to be able to again show that we need true leadership. I mean, these are tough decisions to make. They're not popular, of course not. But there is a national strategic interest. Our national security back home is very much under threat. Having something like a Waziristan in northern Syria, bordering a NATO ally and bordering other allies in the region, is something that's incredibly disturbing. Foreign fighters that have passports, Western passports and visas and stuff like that, if we monitor all of them, if we miss one or two, it could be a disaster. This is why I think leadership is making unpopular decisions. And to be honest with you, I know the president cares a lot about his legacy, but I think he must shift what he's act in a more sort of in a greater leadership way in Syria, or I think that will affect his legacy in the long term. There are more atrocities and more evidence of horrendous crimes that have gone on outside of all of our national security interests in Syria. I think that will come to light as well in the coming weeks and months and so on. And I think hopefully that will add the pressure on the president to move. But yeah, like you said, the administration, I don't think anything. I think its mind is set for now, and it must be pressured by the American people and by Congress and others. And hopefully we can, in terms of bringing to light some of these atrocities, we can create the political space for others to act in a greater leadership role.
Now, a question in the film, as I know most of the story in the film, where is the Iranian in that film? I kind of missed that part. Where is the Iranian in the film?
Well, the film is not a definitive overview of the conflict. We did not, attempt to put a chronological, detailed film that told the story of the conflict, nor is it, a more New York Times op-ed style argument. What it is it's the story of two protagonists, one who's sitting right next to me, and their experiences and seeing the conflict through their lens. So whatever Mouaz and Razan were involved with, that was the story we were telling. Because what we were trying to do is bridge this gap that we perceived exists. And that is with a more emotional, a more human face that an audience could actually engage with and could, feel like it resonates with them. And so Iran, while he mentions Iran, there wasn't anything specific in the couple years, 2+ years that we were covering him that was directly related to the Iran piece, right?
No, and she's right. I mentioned it in passing. I say Tehran flights twice a day, in the morning and at night, and so on, that they're going there. Unfortunately, obviously, I think Iran benefits if it's seen that all the opposition, everybody are just extremists, and the only partner in the region is Iran, and Iran must be supported and so on, and must sort of, when it supports and arms Hezbollah, when it's ruined Iraq, when it's done all these horrendous things in the region. I think it's the most important thing at a time now where there's this reapproachment and everything from the administration, others with the Iranians, to remember helping Iran in providing security in the region is the worst possible idea, because that what happens then is you ensure that you have made deep roots for both Sunni and Shiite extremism in the area. What we need to do is help the people, and the people don't want to be ruled by the Iranians. They don't want to be ruled by extremists, and they're there.
I'm Howard Sumka. I was the USAID director in Bosnia, Albania, and West Bank, Gaza. The film is great. I mean, it's very hard not to have a very visceral, emotional response to it. If I have a pick with it, it's that it casts at the end, John McCain's the good guy who supported us, and Barack Obama is the ditherer who couldn't make a decision. And maybe there's truth to both of those, but in the broader context, you're dealing with American politics. Go back and remember how long it took Bill Clinton to intervene in Bosnia when the case was clear from day one, how much they dawdled in Rwanda when the case was clear from day one. And that led to very quick action in Kosovo. I was the Albania director when the Kosovo refugees came across. And then in the Bush administration, it led to actions in Afghanistan and Iraq that put this country into a decade of bloody, costly war and very bad foreign policy for 10 years. So the situation that was facing Obama, as you acknowledged, he was elected to get us out of Iraq, get us out of Afghanistan. He was in a very, very difficult position. 10 years after the Bosnian peace, after the Dayton Accords, we were still scampering around the country trying to buy back manpads. And I think this is the kind of thing they were thinking about on the issue of arming the opposition. And so I'm just curious about this black and white presentation that the film leaves you with in terms of the Obama and McCain debate. Was that your intent, or is that just kind of how it came out?
There was no intent. We didn't have an agenda when we made the film. So I would say that this is how the arguments that were presented to us evolved. But I can say after being deeply immersed in telling this story close to 3 years, it was very hard not to question the humanity of what was happening, and that backs were turned, and that it seemed that the world was silent. It was hard to quell those emotions even within us, that anger that you have such a catastrophe, and yet we could not get the attention even from my very narrow perspective of broadcasters to pay attention to the story we need to tell. So there wasn't an intent, but I can say that my own opinion now is that I feel there's a lack of imagination. There has to be something between not doing anything and boots in the ground. And I didn't see that as I was covering it for the last 3 years and following Mouaz.
And just to add, I mean, for me personally, I'm a Democrat. I mean, to make a disclaimer, right now I'm a single issue person on Syria as far as foreign policy is concerned, so I don't care either way. But I mean, I worked for President Obama's campaign for doing his first, run for election as a field director and for his campaign in Northern Virginia and other stuff. And the reality is, he is the president. McCain is not, and no one is saying that it's an easy decision to do anything on Syria. All of the options were bad, especially because we were already very late in doing anything. Some of our policy that we reached now, if we had done way earlier on, we wouldn't be where we are now. But the fact is that inaction and the risks of inaction are much, much worse than any of the terrible options that we have on the table. And leadership is to make the right decisions for the sake of the core values and morals that we have in this country and for our national security. And in this case, in Syria, these two align. And so for me, it's hard to give an excuse for anyone, whether I support the person or not, on not acting. And the thing, there aren't two extremes. It's not either boots on the ground. No one's ever requested boots on the ground, right? But we have requested for military support. We have requested for the moderate opposition to defend themselves. We've requested no-fly zones to just allow these areas. Every place we dealt with, we got shelled in. We were in. It's funny because she could make like 6 other movies on Syria because she has amazing stories. We were in a Christian village and we're talking to a priest and creating the first sort of Christian-Muslim civilian council and so on. And the church was shaking from the shelling, in the villages beside us. And you could see these amazing, inspiring people going through that. And while the international community is just sort of sitting down and weighing all these risks, but not weighing the risks of inaction. And we're the United States. We're not just any other government. When the international community does not act, when the United Nations is impotent because of a Russian or Chinese veto, then it's our responsibility to protect civilians.
If I was just to add one thing, and as a disclaimer, I also come from a Democratic Party background. I'm not terribly partisan, but I think the main issue, I take your points. I understand the difficulties. And in meeting with people in the administration to deal with these issues along the way, we understood the downside risks. And I understand that, and they were based on the lessons like you and your organization learned in other places. I think the two main differences I see, what happened in Syria concerning red lines wasn't dithering. I think what happened is in the cases of Bosnia and Kosovo and other conflicts, once we decided to get involved, we got involved. And there was a process to that. You're right. People drug their feet. That's not unusual, particularly for democracies. But in the end, we did get involved, and we saw the issue through. And I think that's the reason why we've put a lot of effort and money and material into achieving that policy. And I think that's the way we should achieve foreign policy. The difference with the Syria issue and what they call the non-strike incident in the government, that's what it's officially called. Remember when we laid down a red line and then didn't do it? It's called the non-strike incident. The difference is that that decision, which even my grandmother, I remember talking to her on the phone the day after it happened, she said, he shouldn't have done that. And I thought she was talking about Bashar gassing people, and she said, no, that's bad. He shouldn't have laid down that red line unless he was willing to enforce it. And I think that's the main difference. And the reason why is I just came back, and I'll tell you a small vignette, I just came back from Moscow, and I attended a conference there put on by the Defense Ministry. And at this conference, the Russian defense minister and other officials put together a narrative that actually Barack Obama is an evil mastermind in the world. I'm paraphrasing here, but you can find the slides online. He is behind all the colored revolutions in the world, absolutely every one of them. It causes people to fight each other and is used as a pretext for military intervention at the UN. So the only way to get in the way of that is to veto everything at the UN and for sovereign governments to shoot their way out of it, and they have to all work together. I think and I think to answer your very good question, I think there are strategic ramifications beyond this that have damaged not only American credibility but American integrity, and it's going to take a lot to get that back if we are if we are interested in getting it back. And that's something that the American people, I suspect that Americans I think they worry a lot about their integrity and about their ability to wage foreign policy. I think they're very involved. I think there is some disagreement over the means to achieve that. And I think Syria was a good example of what not to do. And I don't know anybody that's particularly proud of how it was done. We'll see what the outcome is. Sir?
Raul Alcala. I just returned in March from 10 years in Baghdad. Oh, wow. Most of that time as a U.S. civilian advisor to rather high levels of the Iraqi government. I'd like to just make one comment. And that is that our involvement, be it with boots on the ground or diplomats behind quills, has to be sustained over time, because very few of the events that are taking place in that region of the world are amenable to quick fixes. And so if we enter an engagement with a deadline for removing ourselves, we eliminate the majority of the motivation on both sides, those who would support us and those who are against us. Those who would support us because they fear being left alone, which they have been over time in many places, and those who are against us because they know they can wait us out. After all, it's their neighborhood more than it is ours. So the caution is that you cannot subject this kind of a question to the ballot, because the question will fail every time. No one wants war eternal. No one wants to pay forever. And yet if the engagement requires that kind of commitment, and if it is in some way the fulfillment of American values as sort of a payback to the world for our great good fortune, well, then that's what it's going to take. But you cannot submit that every 2 or 4 years to the ballot. It'll fail every time.
Interesting. Good point. Sir?
Sean Harris, Conflict Armament Research. I just had a quick question. It might be a little technical, so I apologize if it's outside the scope, but we've heard reports of booby-trapped ammunition being used by the Free Syrian Army, planted by the Assad regime. And so we've only heard a couple of reports of that, and we have some photos, but I was wondering if you had any experience on the ground with that.
Yeah, so that was much more prevalent a little bit earlier on. I think the FSA sort of just caught on to it. Fortunately, like everybody who's arming, Gulf states with the battalions with specific agendas, and it's funny because the people are just fighting to defend themselves and defend their families and so on, have to be stuck with specific loyalties based on that funding. And then wherever else people can try to get something to defend themselves against Russian planes, tanks, and so on, but we're looking at Chinese-made AKs and random, things like that. So believe it or not, a lot of the weapons, some of them at least, were bought in, from Lebanon, from like Hezbollah and others and so on, or people party to the conflict in Syria, killing Syrians and working with the regime and so on. It's Ramadan. And, but it's okay.
Sorry, Mouaz.
Like
That's true.
I was kidding. And so, yeah, that happened early on. I haven't heard any reports like recently, but that happened in the past, unfortunately, and it cost the lives of people that were fighting, and that was as a result of buying the actual stuff from either corrupt they're all corrupt, from regime officials that are but that had the idea of, well, we can take people out by booby trapping some of these ammunitions and stuff like that, but not recently. But I know that in the past that happened.
When was the last year of, like 2012 was about the last time you saw that?
Actually, yeah, absolutely, yeah. And since then, I haven't heard of anything like that.
Okay.
Thank you. Jerry Mihalska, activist. Have you tried PBS, for example, Frontline or Independent Lens? And I saw on Frontline, maybe more than a month ago, a story about how the U.S. was training Syrian rebels in Qatar. Okay. And then I heard that they were doing it in Jordan. And then that same week, I heard maybe Senator Feinstein not knowing about this. So this was an interesting denouement, and apparently the executive branch is not telling everybody what they're doing. Well, we understand that, but that seems to be what's going on. Oh. So there might be more of that.
We did try Independent Lens, and unfortunately they said no, but we look at a no as a not now. So it doesn't mean that we're not going to go back to them. Frontline has a very specific formula. So this is an indie-style film and doesn't kind of wedge into the existing structure that they have. But that said, I'm very confident that the film that we put together will find a home. It's just a matter of having to go through some more hoops than one would like. And in full transparency, I'm also a Democrat. Sorry. It's going live stream. I've got to get it out there.
We're not going to tell you who you're going to vote for in the next election, but ma'am.
Anyway, thank you. That was an incredible film, and I appreciate your courage, and the footage that you got was amazing. Just short of military action, I mean, I can think of other things, but one is, what other kinds of ways, interventions can we make that could possibly reduce tension? And also, what was the impact, at least, of eliminating the chemical weapons? I mean, I thought that was a creative, sort of fortuitous. You may disagree. I'm curious if you have another. I would respect your opinion, but what was the effect of that?
Sure, no, thank you. Look, everyone's happy that the chemical weapons, well, the ones that he declared and got rid of, are gone. That's better for everybody in Syria and in the region, and so that's great. Now, in terms of like doing stuff outside of military action, when we threatened the credible use of force, and President Obama just moved a couple of ships in the Mediterranean. A dictator who had at that time never ever said that he's always denied having any chemical weapons and anything like that. Not only declared that he does have them, said that this is where they are, at least for the most part. He didn't declare, for example, chlorine and so on, gas that is still used today in barrel bombs and that still kills civilians. So chemical weapons are still being used, just not the ones declared and destroyed based on the agreement that happened. Which again, getting rid of the chemical weapons, positive. No one can deny that. But when we did that threat and we moved a couple of ships, he declared it and got rid of them. If we wanted, if we showed the international community and the regimes more specifically that the United States is serious about transitioning Syria into a democratic country, that it would like to have a political process. Everybody wants a political transition, everybody on all sides. I do. Nobody wants to see just a purely military takeover and transition there. We don't want to see the Syria more destroyed than it already is and losing all the institutions that we have. Syria was not like Libya. We had institutions and governments and stuff. We had good Syrian law. We just had people that didn't know how to implement it, or a regime that sort of used the country as its own sort of family farm. But if we were to at least lay out a political plan and put an enforcement mechanism to it, saying that we go through these are the steps, like Geneva, which everyone agreed on, including the Russians, and add an enforcement mechanism to it that we're serious about, then I think the regime would actually go along with that, and we might not most likely have to resort to an enforcement mechanism, which could be a no-fly zone, it could be greater arming, and so on. So the credible threat of force in itself is a tool that we can use for political transition and not have to resort to it, a military intervention, per se. So I mean, that's one sort of idea that's out there, and then that was proven by just moving a couple of ships in the Mediterranean, resulted in declaring chemical weapons, getting rid of them, et cetera, et cetera. And so, but when we do regularly make statements that the head of NATO has said multiple times, NATO will never intervene in Syria, it is the most comforting thing that the regime can hear. It's a green light for them to do whatever you want. If you're not going to do anything, for the love of God, don't say it, you know, at least. But so that's my idea.
And I think the one thing to point out about this decision, look, I think you're right that the decision to go back to Congress for authorization, which threw open the debate in the American public in particular, I think Americans were quite rightfully confused about this because the president had not prepared the American public for the intervention and the enforcement of the red line that he had laid down the previous July, which to me as a policy person was very odd because that was not the first time the regime had used chemical weapons. It actually had used them systematically over time, beginning in the fall of 2012. So what happened was, and all of us that know the Assad regime were not surprised, Bashar al-Assad he has a borderline personality, and anybody who knows anybody who has borderline personality knows that what they do is they push red lines, okay, and they push, yes, so you know. So sometimes Bashar is very rational, and sometimes he's not. And you can see this, he's very different than his father in this degree. So what he did was he started pushing the red lines, first with diluted sarin, then greater concentrations, and then there were more incidents. And finally, in June, the administration formally came out, after in the previous March, saying that something had been used, formally came out and said, yes, sarin had been used. So from June until August 21st, there was nothing. No preparation in the American public for what might have to occur. And I think that, again, gets us to the problem of leadership, right? Because if he was going to go back to the American public, which I understand and I support, then he should have prepared them for the choice, the very good choice that the gentleman who just left, talked about. And he didn't do that. And I think it's because I think it was, by that point, was a policy of avoidance. I don't think they wanted to get involved. It was very much his decision, as the accounts that we see in the newspapers. And I think that's the reason why, not to talk anymore about Democrats, but we notice one very prominent Democrat has taken a very different position on Syria in her recent book. In fact, a greater division on Syria than any other issue out there, than Iraq, than anything else, has been Syria. I don't think that's an accident, because she knows very well, this unnamed politician, that this is going to go on for a long time. The ramifications are huge, and that it's going to be the main foreign policy black mark, not only on the United States, but I think also on the Democratic Party for the last 25, 30 years.
Andrea Kalin from the National Democratic Institute. I was just curious, when you were working on setting up the civilian rule and the local councils and all those types of things, what were, I guess, were there particular concepts that were easier for the citizens to understand, or were there certain areas that there were kind of problems, or more, was it harder for them to understand certain concepts than others? What were kind of the lessons learned? What was more effective, what was less effective in setting up those councils?
Well, in Syria it was interesting because each province was very different than another one, and even each area within the province was very different, right? And then depending on the towns too. So Kharbaja Joz, the one in here, is a very small town. We worked in Meskene, 100,000 people is a lot more. So each one had its own sort of logistical challenges, and also the challenges of the reality on the ground. So the first thing that we always had to identify was, what were the battalions in the area? Were they transient battalions? Were they local? Oftentimes when they're local battalions, it's much easier to deal with them. What was surprisingly smooth was the fact that when we did come to the battalion saying that we're here representing the civilians and the locals of this area who have all come together to create a civilian council that they at least pseudo-democratically wanted to elect and run their own affairs, and we would like you to become a Department of Defense. Your job will be to fight the regime, DOD for this village, you know, in the civil, you're not going to be policing it, you're not going to be judge, executioner, you know, whatever, you're not going to be providing administrative tasks, which they couldn't even do anyway if they wanted to. It was surprising that most of these battalions would take, they'd understand that it's important for them to have a good relationship with the locals in that area, even if they were from other places, or if they were localized, they already understood. So what was very inspiring, I mean, none of it is really our work. I mean, we didn't do anything. We just came down and we wanted to sort of put pen to paper and make these sort of different parameters, that the civilian council runs the affairs of the town, humanitarian aid should go to it, it should provide it to everybody else, that they should have educational, health offices, different things. The civilian police took orders from the civilian council, and that the battalions stayed away from governance. And for each place, the challenges were met by the locals themselves. And so like one piece of advice that we say to bigger implementers, and we work a lot with many of them, is to say that, you know, you should take the lead from the people on the ground. They know how to govern their village. They don't need to be trained on how to govern their village. What they do need is the capacity to provide assistance and to provide services. And we shouldn't arbitrarily give humanitarian aid either. We should do it to the right people so that we empower them more, because no one cares if a civilian council got trained by American officials on how to run a town. No one cares about that. But if they come back with flour and aid and we fix electricity and stuff like that, it makes all the difference. So it's a much longer conversation to go into the details of sort of the challenges, and I'm happy to sort of to talk to you later offline about this. But I think that the biggest thing is to invest in the people themselves, because once they believe that this is really now their village or their town and so on, they are the best guardians and custodians of it, and they really know how to face those challenges. But again, the most important thing is to make sure that the battalions take no governing role, that they act as, you know, defending against the regime and so on, and that civilian police are the ones that sort of run affairs, and that there is a civilian court system that goes along with it. So police uniforms, I feel, are just as important as flour and oil and water, because it provides people a sense of security, and it shows them that they can have a normal life. And then you see people investing in their own towns.
I think it's also interesting, the outreach to women. Many of the women understood, looking at the revolutions in Libya and Tunisia and Egypt, that they were very active on the ground, and then they got pushed out as the societies were formed and governments were replaced. So the Syrian women are very aware of that fact and were concentrated on not having that happen to them. So I think that they imposed themselves in a very constructive way, that they were not going to get pushed aside. And they would point out these disparities, that you would have like 4 million people in Aleppo, but not a single woman on a local council in Aleppo. And so they were the ones that were making the noise about that. And I actually found that incredibly impressive, that it was very grassroots. This was not top down or outside in. This was another form of revolution that I was witnessing unfolding before me, and it was really directed very organically by the Syrian women themselves.
Well put. Sir.
Yeah, my name is Warren Madison. With several organizations, but basically I'm an activist, and for the sake of transparency, I'm a former Democrat. But it's a wonderful film.
The room now.
Yeah, we should not be doing that.
A neo-Democrat, yeah.
But the film was excellent. It brought forth a lot of problems. But in hearing what this gentleman who just left a little while ago had to say, I can't help but wonder whether it went far enough in exposing the danger from jihadism, imposition of Sharia, which, how can, you got the experience. How do we extrapolate to a larger scale what that total threat is to this country and the world?
Yeah, well, it's a gigantic threat, both extremism of any kind, but also Shia and Sunni extremism in the region, imbibed by Iran, imbibed by al-Qaeda and ISIS. You know, the Iranians, obviously, we don't have to get into that. We all understand why they are a threat and destabilizing force in the region. ISIS and al-Qaeda in Iraq, like you said, the gentleman, whoever it was from the Free Syria Army that was warning of jihadis coming, we said this all along, that we didn't have, first of all, it was 9 months of peaceful protests, bare chests were met with bullets and unlawful arrests, horrendous sort of killing of civilians, and it doesn't take rocket science, but horrendous, miserable conditions like this, complete apathy by the entire world breeds extremism. That's just the way it is, because people have nothing else to turn to, and the only ones that are coming to help are these guys that want to implement sort of their own form of Islam, which I don't think Sharia is a much longer discussion of what that means and how it is and so on. But they want to come and they want to create an Islamic caliphate like al-Baghdadi that is now in Iraq and in Syria, who killed those two guys, those two young men, 24 and 29 years old. One of them spoke 5 languages. Amazing young people that were murdered for working for a democratic, pluralistic Syria. No country in the world, not the United States or anybody else, fears extremism in Syria and the future of Syria as threat by extremism than the Syrian people themselves. No one wants to get rid of extremists and terrorists, whether that be the regime in Iran or whether that be Hezbollah or al-Qaeda or ISIS, than the Syrian people themselves. And the solutions remain the same. We need to support the people that are willing to risk and are risking and dying every day to fight both against Iran, aka the regime, Bashar al-Assad, it's the same thing, and extremists at the same time. That threat is an incredible threat to our national security here at home, and the only way to go to end it is to learn from our own experience in Iraq. It wasn't our idea to do the awakening. We were being begged by the tribal leaders and Sunni Muslims all over Iraq to say, support us, we'll get rid of al-Qaeda. They got rid of them in a matter of a couple of nights. And it's not easy for something like ISIS, only a few thousand people, to go to a country, to a city like Mosul of 2 million people and take it over in a night. It's not because they're just amazing fighters that can just win, but it's because we are not fighting their ideology. We seem to think that that the Iranians are somehow could be used as a constructive force or could fight terrorism, not understanding that if an Iranian or the Assad regime kills one extremist, he helps them recruit 100 more. But when Sunnis and moderates and Muslims or whoever, the people of the region that want their country to come back to them, when they kill one extremist, they get 6 or they get 100 more extremists defecting and leaving them. That's the way that we should approach this. And unfortunately, our approach, if anything, has been to continuously support Maliki's government. It's been horrendous. To maybe think about dealing with Iran on countering extremism, which is a horrible idea. That means you just make sure Shiite and Sunni extremism are there forever. So as complicated as the situation is, the solution is really quite simple, and you've got the people that are dying for it every single day. Yet we do not take leadership because it's not politically good now. The polls don't look that way. But being president is not about, it's about doing the right thing and making the tough decisions. And he can sell the case to the American people. He doesn't have to wait and ask them whether chemical weapons are bad or not to kill 1,500 people, mostly children, in a day.
Sporadic. Was that done to any great extent, and do the Syrians benefit from the Israeli medical assistance?
In the Golan Heights, the Israelis did set up, as far from the information that I've heard from media and from speaking to people on the ground, in the Golan Heights, they did set up like hospitals and field hospitals and stuff. I know a lot of civilians were treated there and returned back to Syria. At the end of the day, we all understand the sensitivities of the region, especially now. Everything is sort of aflame. But the fact is, humans are humans, and I hope that that these movements by the Arab Spring, where many people are sort of criticizing and so on, at the end of the day, that was the first time that the Arab Street came out and was not protesting Israel or the United States or whatever. They were out there protesting these horrendous regimes and dictators that run their countries. And for the most part, these protests and this golden opportunity has been left to go to waste. And I still hope that we can come back and reinvest in the people again.
My question is a little bit more about the Democrat people who aren't in government, and I think this film is kind of an indictment of them, and we have to hold them responsible as well. And I would love it if you could unpack a little bit your conversation on Chris Hayes with Jeremy Scahill, and kind of, I want to hear your explanation of why all of these socially minded Democrats, why this isn't kind of taking hold and why the message isn't taking hold. Is that a leadership issue, or that's my question.
So, well, one thing is it's a leadership issue. You look at the polling for U.S. Just general public's view of Syria and whether the United States should do something or not pre-chemical weapons attack, even though there's a lot of horrendous things that have happened and so on. It was very low. When the president came out and just spoke a little bit, he gave one speech talking about it and tried, just barely, didn't even try, but sort of like a little bit tried to sell, that something horrible happened. The polls that came afterwards showed a significant change. So it is a matter of leadership in the sense that it's the president's job to go out and say there's something horrendous happening in the world. It also affects their national security, and we should do something about it. Unless the president wants to kick the ball down the road for whoever comes next, in which case that lack of leadership leaves the American public sort of blind to it. But another part is, we did a horrible job. I think, me in sort of our organizations in terms of being able to bring awareness to the American public. We lack funds. Trust me, we have like zero money, and we don't have the ability to like set up PR campaigns that show the realities on the ground. So unfortunately, look, when I speak to my friends, I went to high school in Arkansas, and I speak to Arkansans about what's happening, show them pictures and stuff like that. Oh my God, they want to do anything possible to help the situation. So the American people are, they feel that the obligation that they have to help, their fellow human beings across the world. Unfortunately, they don't see the realities. And what they do see on media is some crazy guy like al-Baghdadi and, the debacle of Iraq and so on, and mishandling in some ways of Afghanistan, all these different things, and say, oh, look, it's another Middle East thing, terrorists killing terrorists, Muslim killing Muslims, whatever they want to say, and they just want to stay away from it. They don't realize, and I wish they knew who Syrians were, because they're very much like us here. These people that had normal lives, 60 years, they were stable, they're not used to war. And if they knew that their lives have been turned upside down, and it's just as if it happened here in the United States, I think people would be much more willing to help. So a lack of leadership, but also a bad job by the opposition to show the world a clearer picture of what's happening on the ground. And I hope that we can do more, and hopefully this film does more to show that something horrible is happening there, and progressive Democrats and everybody should act more than anyone else to stop what's happening. I mean, we lived through things like Rwanda. That was all in our lifetime, and we say to ourselves, never again. How could we have ever allowed something like this to happen? If it ever happens again, we'll make damn sure that we'll act then. Well, we are living an ever again moment now, more very, very horrible and ongoing, and mostly the people that are suffering are children. So I hope that maybe we can wake up and stop this now before we just regret it years later and say, oh, well, if we knew, we would have done something. We know, and I hope we can do stuff.
I think also in Syria, because you didn't have the presence of foreign correspondents, there was a really limited conduit of information. And that's why, as I said earlier, we wanted to make this film, is because we felt the human stories were being left out. Who in this audience knew that police personnel were being outfitted with uniforms, that they were trying these valiant efforts to create these civil governance? Probably not many. And I would say that this is an informed audience that should have known those kinds of things. So I think the human side of the story has been missing from the mainstream coverage. And I think in that way we've intellectualized it. So it's abstracted for us. Oh, there's another 40,000, another 10, another 15. And it just becomes statistics and numbers. And we don't understand how that plays out on a very personal level and what that means on the ground, and the connections that we have to those people that are suffering. I think all of those links, those bridges, have been cut or never created. And I think that that's also part of our collective responsibility. It's our collective humanity here that's at stake, that any of us could turn away from what's been happening.
So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Andrea and Mouaz and Razan.